Welcome, dear literature enthusiasts, to another shared moment where cinema becomes less about spectacle and more about story, less about the mechanics of plot and more about the shadows it leaves inside us. I am genuinely glad you're here. This space we're building together, one of thoughtful, intellectual exploration, feels like a book club that just happens to take film as its subject. Tonight, I want to talk about The Talented Mr. Ripley, 1999, a film that has haunted me since the first time I saw it. Not because of its beauty alone, but because of the uncomfortable reflections it stirs in me. Before we move forward, let me pause and ask, in the kindest way, that if you enjoy these journeys, you consider liking and subscribing. It helps keep this little circle alive, so that we can continue speaking about films not as mere entertainment, but as texts, layered and ambiguous, worthy of being read like literature. And, as always, let me make it clear, this is not a conventional movie review. What follows is a deeply intellectual and critical analysis, a theoretical exploration meant for those of us who come to film with the same patience and curiosity with which we approach novels, poems, and plays. My first encounter with this story was unsettling in a way I didn't expect. I was drawn in by the sun-drenched images of Italy, the beauty of coastal villages, the elegance of jazz clubs echoing with laughter and trumpets. But beneath the postcard charm, there was something darker that clung to me, a sense of dread that whispered even in moments of glamour. I remember watching it late at night, caught between fascination and unease, and realizing that what disturbed me most wasn't the violence or deception, but the recognition. The yearning to belong, to be seen, to inhabit a life brighter than one's own. That is a hunger I think many of us know, even if we rarely admit it. The story lingers because it dramatizes that yearning in its most dangerous form, showing us what happens when longing turns into obsession, when identity becomes a costume rather than a truth. The premise is deceptively simple. A young man of modest means, skilled in mimicry and charm, is sent abroad to retrieve the wayward son of a wealthy shipping magnate. What begins as a job quickly becomes something more, a chance to slip into a world of luxury and ease, a world he has watched from afar but never inhabited. He befriends the young heir and his radiant companion, basking in their effortless privilege, their laughter, their golden skin under Mediterranean light. For a while, he is tolerated, even embraced. But cracks appear, as they always do. Envy festers. Resentment grows. The difference between being invited and being truly accepted becomes impossible to ignore. And when that difference hardens into rejection, his desperation takes a darker turn. What fascinates me is how the film seduces us alongside him. The camera lingers on yachts bobbing in azure water, on sunlit piazzas, on extravagant parties where music swells and laughter flows like wine. We, too, are drawn into that glamour, dazzled by its beauty. Yet the same lens that caresses these images also sharpens the edges of unease. Shadows lengthen. Smiles curdle into smirks. Charm conceals cruelty. The very beauty that draws us and also traps us, reminding us that envy often wears the mask of admiration. This duality, the allure and the poison of beauty, is what gives the story its hypnotic tension. The characters become mirrors of the protagonist's own fractured self. The wealthy heir is everything he longs to be, confident, careless, adored. His partner represents not just love, but acceptance, a world of intimacy and ease he longs to claim. The friends who circle them embody the effortless entitlement of privilege, so casual it doesn't even recognize itself. Against them, the protagonist is an intruder, a chameleon whose only skill is adaptation. He can mirror their voices, mimic their tastes, learn their games, but he cannot truly belong. Watching this unfold, I felt the sting of that word, belonging. How often do we tailor ourselves to fit, to be included, to be welcomed into circles that never quite feel like ours? And what does that tailoring cost us? The plot turns on moments of exclusion. A careless insult, a shrug of dismissal, a reminder, spoken or unspoken, that he is a guest, not a peer. Each small rejection cuts deeper. Each smile hides condescension, until longing hardens into rage. The violence, when it comes, is shocking not just because of its brutality, but because of its inevitability. It feels less like a choice than a collapse, the breaking of a dam that has been straining from the start. And what follows is a descent into deception, so elaborate it becomes almost a second life. Identities are forged again, and discarded. Lies multiply. Every smile conceals terror of being discovered. The glamour curdles into paranoia. What grips me most is the way the film blurs sympathy and revulsion. We are horrified by his actions, yes, but we also feel the ache of his yearning, the desperation behind his lies. He is monstrous, but he is also human, and that duality unsettles us. It unsettled me, because who among us has not, at some point, wanted to step out of our own skin and into another's? Who has not looked at someone else's life and thought, if only I could be them, if only I could be seen the way they are seen? The difference is that most of us stop at yearning. He does not. He turns yearning into theft, into violence, into survival. The story teases us with questions it refuses to answer neatly. Does he ever feel guilt, or only fear of being caught? Does he love the people he deceives, or does he only love what they represent? Does he even know where his lies end and his self begins? These are literary questions, not cinematic ones, and that's why the film feels so rich for analysis. It doesn't just show events. It meditates on identity, envy, desire, and the peril of becoming a mirror instead of a person. For me, the most haunting element is the silence at the end, the realization that all the masks, all the performances have trapped him in isolation. He has gained everything he wanted: wealth, recognition, the appearance of belonging. And yet he is utterly alone, condemned to maintain a lie that can never be relaxed. That silence lingers long after the credits, a reminder that to live entirely as performance is to erase oneself. And so, my friends, as we open this exploration together, let this introduction serve not as a conclusion, but as an invitation. The film is not about crime alone, nor about deception, nor even about envy. It is about the fragility of identity, the hunger for belonging, and the danger of mistaking admiration for love. It resonates with me because it whispers truths we rarely admit: that beauty can intoxicate and destroy, that longing can become obsession, and that the masks we wear to be accepted can become prisons we cannot escape. In the chapters ahead, we'll journey deeper, through the characters who embody privilege and desperation, through the symbols hidden in yachts and jazz clubs, through the moral ambiguities that make this story less a thriller than a tragedy. But for now, let me simply say, I'm grateful you are here, ready to think, ready to feel, ready to read film as literature. Together, we will linger in the shadows this story casts, and perhaps, in doing so, find reflections of our own. The story opens not with thunder, but with suggestion, the kind of quiet unease that feels like a ripple beneath calm water. We are introduced to a young man whose life seems, at first glance, to be defined by the margins. An accompanist at a piano, a borrowed jacket with a monogram that does not belong to him, a role always adjacent but never central. There is something immediately telling in this introduction. He is both visible and invisible, noticed only because of what he borrows, admired only when he reflects someone else's light. Even in these earliest moments, the narrative whispers what it will become: a study of imitation, of hunger for belonging, of the fine line between performance and identity. The first half of the story unfolds with an invitation, one that arrives almost by accident. He is mistaken for someone of means, believed to be a man of connections, and rather than correct the error, he allows it to expand. This single choice, so small, so seemingly harmless, sets everything else in motion. It is fascinating to me how much of life turns on such moments, the temptation to allow a misunderstanding to stand because it benefits us, because it feels like a door cracked open to a room we thought forever closed. In his case, the misunderstanding delivers him into the orbit of wealth. A shipping magnate notices him and sends him across the ocean with a task: bring back a wayward son squandering his life abroad. For a man with no prospects, no identity beyond borrowed roles, this is both employment and opportunity. The journey itself carries symbolism. To leave New York for Italy is to leave behind the grayness of survival for a sun-drenched world of possibility. The cinematography frames this shift with precision. The muted tones of America give way to the lush Mediterranean palette, skies too blue to be real, waters shimmering like temptation itself. He steps into this landscape not as himself, but as a role player, carrying the hope that proximity to beauty will somehow make it his own. Watching this, I felt the sting of recognition. How often do we believe that geography, that proximity, that mere nearness to brilliance will transform us? That to sit at someone else's table is to inherit their feast? He finds a young heir, golden with privilege, and the woman who adores him, radiant with ease. They live in sunlit villas, spend afternoons sailing yachts, wander through markets as though the world is theirs to sample. Their laughter floats, effortless, carrying the arrogance of those who have never worried about bills, about hunger, about belonging. For the protagonist, stepping into their orbit is intoxicating. He becomes their companion, their court jester, their confidant. For a time, he is allowed to bask in the warmth of their privilege, to feel as though he has been admitted into the circle. Yet cracks show quickly. The heir, charming and magnetic, is also careless, cruel in the way of people who have never been denied. He treats affection as a toy, loyalty as a given. The woman, though kinder, begins to see the strangeness in the man who hovers always at the edges, watching too closely, wanting too much. The first half of the plot is charged with this tension. He is close enough to taste the life he desires, but never close enough to truly belong. He is a guest, not a peer. He is tolerated, not embraced. And tolerance, when it falters, curdles into rejection. What I find striking is how the film seduces us alongside him. We are dazzled by the villas, the jazz clubs, the Mediterranean light. We too want to stay in this world forever. The director uses this seduction deliberately, drawing us into the same intoxication, so that when the rejection comes, we feel it too. It is not just his loss, it is ours. That identification makes what follows all the more unsettling. The heir grows restless with his shadow. He mocks him, dismisses him, reminds him of his true place. The small humiliations pile up, and with each one, the protagonist's yearning deepens into resentment. His mimicry becomes more than flattery. It becomes practice. He learns the heir's mannerisms, his handwriting, his voice. He doesn't simply admire. He rehearses. It is both chilling and poignant, because it reveals not only envy, but a desperate hunger to erase the self that feels unworthy. Watching him, I thought of times I've tried to become someone else to fit a role, to mirror others so I would not be excluded. For most of us, this is fleeting, a defense mechanism. For him, it is destiny. The first half builds toward a confrontation. On a boat, under the sun, tensions spill over. What begins as mockery escalates into rejection, so sharp it feels like a blade. The heir laughs, belittles, dismisses, reminding the protagonist that he will never be more than a hanger-on. And in that moment, something inside him breaks. Violence erupts, shocking in its intimacy, brutal in its inevitability. The boat rocks, the sea swallows sound, and when silence returns, everything has changed. This act, sudden, irreversible, marks the end of innocence, if innocence ever existed at all. It is the moment where longing becomes crime, where yearning becomes survival. It is horrifying, and yet it feels like the natural culmination of everything that came before. We are horrified, but not surprised. And perhaps that is what unsettles us most, though we saw it coming, and we felt the inevitability of it. The first half of the story closes here, with the body of a friend sinking beneath the waves and a man staring into the water, knowing that he has crossed a threshold he can never return from. The sun still shines, the sea still sparkles, but everything is poison now. The The second half will follow him into deception, into paranoia, into the labyrinth of lies that emerge from this moment. But for now, the first half leaves us suspended between beauty and horror, asking ourselves how a man so desperate to belong could turn yearning into violence. And I admit, as I sat with this part of the story, I felt less judgment than unease. Because beneath the horror, there's something recognizable. The desire to be loved, to be included, to be someone other than who we are. Most of us stop at envy, at longing. He does not. He crosses the line. And the first half of the film dares us to ask, how far would we go if rejection cut deep enough? The second half begins in silence, the kind of silence that follows catastrophe, where the world looks the same but feels irrevocably altered. The sun still glitters on the water, the villas still bask in golden light, but inside him there is only dread and the pulsing urgency of survival. He has crossed a threshold, and the film makes no attempt to soften that reality. What fascinates me is how quickly survival turns into performance. He does not collapse into grief, at least not outwardly. He pivots. He begins to construct. He begins to become. The disappearance of the air is, at first, a problem to conceal. There are questions to answer, suspicions to deflect. But soon, concealment turns into opportunity. He slips into the role of the man he has eliminated, writing letters in his hand, adopting his tone, learning to embody his confidence. It is chilling to watch how fluidly he steps into this identity, as though he has been rehearsing for this moment all along. And in truth, he has. Every mimicry, every imitation, every rehearsal of voice and manner becomes the foundation of this performance. He is no longer just himself. He is himself and another, interwoven into a mask, so convincing it fools even those who should know better. The second half unfolds as a series of increasingly elaborate deceptions. Friends, acquaintances, even lovers are manipulated, convinced, deceived. He spins webs of letters and appearances, creating an illusion of presence for the absent heir, while simultaneously carving a new life for himself. The duality is breathtaking in its audacity. He is both the vanished man and the one left behind, speaking for both, moving between roles with terrifying ease. The tension comes not only from the fear of being caught, but from the realization that he may no longer know where the act ends and the self begins. What unsettles me most is how seductive the deception becomes. There are moments when he seems almost at peace, basking in a luxury he once only observed from the margins. Apartments filled with fine furniture, clothes that fit his imagined self, invitations that would once have been unthinkable, all now his. The camera lingers on these moments with a kind of dangerous beauty, inviting us to feel the pull of this false life. And I confess I felt it too. I caught myself admiring the ease, the glamour, the recognition, before remembering that it was all built on a foundation of lies and blood. That, I think, is the film's most brilliant trick. It seduces us into complicity, then confronts us with our own discomfort. But paranoia creeps in. Lies multiply, and with them, the risk of collapse. Every encounter threatens exposure. Every friend who asks a question, every acquaintance who notices a detail, becomes a danger. The narrative builds like a tightening net, the walls closing in even as he maintains the mask. The jazz clubs and piazzas, once sites of joy, become stages of fear. Smiles are strained, laughter forced, conversations laced with subtext. He cannot relax, because the illusion requires constant vigilance. What began as longing has become imprisonment. The most tragic element of the second half is the way intimacy slips through his fingers. The woman, kind and perceptive, begins to sense the truth. Her questions grow sharper, her trust wavers. For a moment, it seems he might confess, might risk vulnerability instead of compounding deception. But fear wins. He cannot allow himself to be seen, truly seen. To be known would be to be condemned. So he doubles down, choosing the lie over the possibility of love. That choice, repeated again and again, is what makes the second half less a thriller than a tragedy. There are other moments of reckoning. Friends who knew the air begin to circle back, asking questions, probing the gaps in his story. Some accept his lies, others do not. The threat of exposure grows sharper, and with it, his desperation. More violence follows, each act both self-preservation and self-destruction. Each choice entangles him deeper in the web, until escape is no longer possible. He becomes both predator and prisoner, trapped in a performance that consumes him. What fascinates me is the way the film refuses to grant him peace. Even when he succeeds, even when the lie holds, the silence afterward is suffocating. He gains everything he once desired: luxury, recognition, the appearance of belonging. But he is utterly alone. The last images are not of triumph, but of despair. The mask, so carefully constructed, has become permanent. He cannot take it off, because to do so would be to face the truth of his actions, the emptiness beneath the performance. The second half, then, is not about escape, but entrapment. It is the slow tightening of a noose woven from lies, the transformation of longing into paranoia, the erasure of self beneath layers of performance. Watching it, I felt both horror and pity. Horror at the violence, the deception, the coldness of his choices. Pity at the recognition that all of it stemmed from a hunger we all know, the desire to be loved, to belong, to step into a life brighter than our own. The tragedy is not only what he does, but what he loses: the chance to be known, the chance to be loved, the chance to live without masks. And that, I think, is why the second half lingers so powerfully. It is not a tale of cleverness or triumph. It is a tale of isolation, of the cost of mistaking admiration for love, of the danger of confusing performance with identity. It leaves us unsettled because it whispers that we, too, wear masks, that we, too, long for lives not our own, that we, too, risk becoming prisoners of the personas we create. The film ends not with closure, but with silence. A silence that feels like condemnation, like grief, like truth. The yachts still sail, the piazzas still glow, but the man at the center is alone, swallowed by the very dream he pursued. It is a tragedy not because he failed, but because he succeeded, because in becoming what he wanted, he lost himself entirely. Characters in this story are never mere players shuffling across a stage. They are fragments of longing, privilege, envy, and vulnerability, colliding with one another until sparks burn everything down. The brilliance of a narrative lies in how each figure is not just a person, but a reflection of an idea, identity, class, desire, or power, and how, together, they weave a tapestry of human frailty that feels both intoxicating and suffocating. To analyze them is to pull at threads that are all too familiar, because even when their actions horrify us, the impulses behind them are recognizable. At the center, of course, is the young man whose name lingers like a secret. He is a character defined by mimicry, by the ability to watch and then become. His talent is not limited to mathematics, music, or charm. His true genius is imitation. He absorbs accents, mannerisms, tastes. He can fit into any room because he is willing to shed himself in order to reflect whoever occupies the space. And yet, that chameleon quality is both gift and curse. He could belong everywhere and nowhere at once. For me, he is haunting because he embodies a question I've wrestled with myself. If we become only what others want to see, who are we when the lights go out? His yearning is palpable. He doesn't simply want wealth. He wants recognition, intimacy, love. But the tragedy is that he confuses being admired for being accepted. And in that confusion, he unravels. His violence shocks us, but the seed of it, the terror of rejection, is something most of us know. Standing opposite him is the golden heir, a figure of effortless privilege. He is charming, magnetic, and cruel in the careless way of those who have never been denied. He draws people to him easily, not because of deliberate effort, but because of the aura that comes with wealth and beauty. He is a sun around which others orbit, basking in his glow, while never realizing that his warmth can burn. His treatment of the protagonist is telling. At first indulgent, then mocking, finally dismissive. He doesn't see him as equal, only as novelty, a companion to be tolerated until boredom sets in. This character is important not just for who he is, but for what he represents, the kind of person who seems to have been born into the life others kill themselves to achieve. Watching him, I was reminded of people in my own life who moved through the world with that same casual entitlement, unaware of how their smallest gestures carried weight for those who had less. The woman who loves the air functions as both anchor and mirror. She is intelligent, perceptive, and at times warmer than he deserves. She sees more than he does, sensing the strangeness in the protagonist long before others do. Her kindness is tinged with suspicion, her affection with discernment. What makes her fascinating is the way she embodies intimacy as truth. She does not want performance, she wants presence. Her tragedy is that she is drawn into a world of masks and lies, believing in sincerity where none exists. In her, I see the cost of trust, the way openness can be exploited, the way love can blind us to shadows until it is too late. Circling them is a constellation of friends and acquaintances, each one reinforcing the themes of class and belonging. There is the sharp-tongued friend, suspicious from the start, who sees through the protagonist's charm and names what others ignore. She functions as a voice of reality, though her bluntness makes her easy to dismiss. There are the others who hover at parties and dinners, embodiments of privilege, so casual they don't even notice it. Together, they form the world the protagonist longs to enter, a world that never truly opens its doors to him. They are not villains, but they are complicit, blind to the hunger growing in the man they treat as entertainment. Even minor figures, the shipping magnate who sends him abroad, the acquaintances fooled by his masks, play important roles. They represent the larger structures that make the story possible. The father embodies authority and wealth, seeing his son's life as business, his relationships as transactions. The acquaintances remind us of how easily charm and performance can deceive, how fragile our grasp on truth really is when appearances are convincing enough. The brilliance of these characters lies in how they are drawn not as archetypes, but as contradictions. The protagonist is both genius and fraud, both tender and monstrous. The heir is both charismatic and cruel, both generous in moments and callous in others. The woman is both trusting and discerning, both open and blind. Each character contains fractures, and it is through those fractures that the story seeps into us. Symbolically, each figure also embodies a force acting on the protagonist. The heir is the embodiment of desire, wealth, beauty, privilege. The woman is the embodiment of love and intimacy, the possibility of being seen and accepted. The suspicious friend is the embodiment of truth, the voice that names what he hides. The father is the embodiment of power, the reminder that all belonging is conditional when wealth dictates the terms. And he, at the center, is the embodiment of longing, the human desire to be more than what we are, twisted into obsession. What unsettles me most about these characters is how familiar their dynamics feel. The heir's dismissive cruelty is recognizable to anyone who has stood outside privilege. The woman's trust is recognizable to anyone who has loved too easily. The friend's suspicion is recognizable to anyone who has seen through lies but been ignored. And the protagonist's hunger is recognizable to anyone who has looked at another life and thought, if only. That recognition is what makes the film feel literary rather than merely cinematic. It does not give us strangers, but reflections of ourselves, distorted and magnified. When I think about this ensemble, I realize that the true tragedy is not just in the violence or the lies, but in the relationships themselves. Each bond is poisoned by inequality, friendships built on hierarchy, love undermined by deception, trust destroyed by envy. No connection is pure. because all are shadowed by the protagonist's inability to reveal himself. The characters orbit one another like planets, each exerting gravitational pull, each shaping the trajectory of the others, until collision becomes inevitable. In the end, what makes these characters unforgettable is not just their actions, but the way they embody universal conflicts. They remind us that belonging can be conditional, that love can be fragile, that privilege can be invisible to those who hold it, and that longing can become destructive when it is denied. They are not just figures in a narrative. They are emblems of forces we all recognize, forces that shape our own lives in subtler, quieter ways. There are films where the strangest facts come from accidents on set, or from bloated budgets and clashing egos. Then there are films like this one, where the strangeness lies less in scandal and more in the quiet, uncanny details that shape how a story is remembered. To linger on the oddities of this production is to peel back layers of glamour and realize how many accidents, improvisations, and contradictions came together to create something that feels inevitable only in hindsight. One of the strangest truths begins before a single frame was shot. This was not the first time Patricia Highsmith's slippery creation had been brought to the screen. In the 1960s, a French adaptation, Plein Soleil, had already captured some of the character's darkness. Yet this new version dared to retell the story at the close of the 20th century, when audiences were less comfortable with ambiguity. What's peculiar is that it worked. In an era dominated by neat Hollywood endings, the filmmakers doubled down on moral complexity and made it into a cultural conversation. That alone feels like a strange anomaly, a risk that shouldn't have succeeded in the marketplace, but did. The casting process was filled with its own oddities. The lead role was offered to several established stars before landing in the hands of an actor still building his identity. What's strange is how perfect the fit became. Here was a performer known for his boyish charm, suddenly embodying duplicity and desperation. In interviews, he admitted that the hardest part was not the violence, but the vulnerability, the way the character's longing mirrored his own fears of never quite belonging in Hollywood. That slippage between actor and role, where performance and autobiography blur, is one of the eeriest truths behind the production. The Mediterranean setting became its own source of strangeness. Italy was chosen for its sun-drenched beauty, but the contrast between setting and story produced an uncanny effect. Crew members recalled shooting brutal, paranoid scenes against backdrops, so idyllic they looked like postcards. Extras in fishing villages sometimes had no idea what the film was about. They just marveled at the cameras and the Americans staging arguments in piazzas. The tension between surface beauty and underlying horror mirrored the narrative itself, as though the country became a character in complicity with the story. Improvisation gave rise to several uncanny moments. The actors playing the heir and his companions often slipped into unscripted banter, lines born from their own personalities that blurred into the fiction. One famous exchange, mocking, playful, then cutting, wasn't on the page at all, but came out of the rhythm of the moment. The director kept the cameras rolling, capturing authenticity too jagged to script. The result is that many of the film's sharpest humiliations feel eerily real, because they were not entirely planned. Another strange fact, the wardrobes. The clothing choices became iconic. Linen suits, sunglasses, silk dresses, and helped define the film's aura of elegance. But behind the scenes, costume fittings were often chaotic. One actor joked that he had never worn so much white, terrified he would spill coffee before takes. Yet those wardrobe choices, born from meticulous attention to detail, became symbols of class difference. The protagonist's suits are slightly ill-fitting, his fabrics less refined, signaling his outsider status even as he mimics privilege. That strangeness, that a jacket or a hemline could carry so much subtext, is a testament to how cinema embeds meaning in texture. The violence at sea, central to the film's first half, carried its own behind-the-scenes peculiarities. Filming on water is notoriously difficult. Sunlight shifting, boats drifting, sound ruined by waves. Crew members described the sequence as grueling, repeated over and over until exhaustion set in. But exhaustion created authenticity. By the time the cameras captured the decisive moment, the actors were drained, their movements sloppy, their tempers frayed. The messiness made the scene more real, as though the Mediterranean itself conspired to strip away polish. Perhaps the strangest ripple of all was cultural. In the months after release, critics debated not just the film's artistry, but its morality. Some audiences were disturbed by how much sympathy they felt for the central character. Others were unsettled by the subtext of desire, particularly the way it complicated ideas of sexuality in mainstream cinema. What's odd is how much of that conversation was unplanned. The filmmakers didn't anticipate how provocative the characters' fluid affections would be in 1999. It became one of the film's most discussed aspects, praised for daring to blur boundaries long kept rigid in Hollywood storytelling. On a more human level, the cast camaraderie carried its own quirks. Several actors bonded so deeply on location that they spent off days together exploring coastal towns, playing music, dining late into the night. Locals often mistook them for real friends rather than a film crew. That energy bled into the performances, making the friendships and betrayals on screen feel sharper because they were born from genuine affection off-screen. To this day, some of them speak of that shoot as one of the most memorable of their careers, a time when work and life blurred. The score also hides a strangeness. Jazz threads through the film, echoing in clubs and parties, becoming both soundtrack and symbol. The music is seductive, improvisational, yet also unsettling in its unpredictability. What's peculiar is that several of the actors learned to play instruments or sing for authenticity, stumbling through rehearsals until they could convincingly fake ease. Those rehearsals, described as chaotic and frustrating, ended up creating performances that captured the awkwardness of trying to appear natural in a world where one doesn't belong. Again, life imitated art. Actors pretending to belong in a jazz band mirrored their characters pretending to belong in privilege. One of the most haunting strange facts is how the film has aged. At its release, some viewers dismissed it as a stylish thriller. But over time, it has been reappraised as a meditation on identity, class, and desire. Scholars now write about it in journals, teaching it in literature and film courses, dissecting its layers as though it were a novel. The strangeness is how something once treated as genre entertainment now stands beside the great works of psychological drama, its reputation growing as if it has been quietly whispering to us for decades. And then there's the strangest fact of all, the way the story echoes in life. How many of us, watching it, have felt the sting of envy, the hunger to belong, the temptation to slip into a mask? How many of us have recognized in the protagonist not his crimes, but his yearning? That, to me, is the deepest strangeness that a tale of lies and violence feels, at its core, so deeply human. We recoil from what he does, yet we understand why he does it. The film's oddest achievement is not that it entertains, but that it unsettles by holding up a mirror and daring us to look. Critical perspectives on this film are a chorus of contradictions, each one insisting it has found the essence of the story, yet all of them together forming something far richer than any single interpretation. To sit with the commentary, the scholarship, the debates, and the memories of audience reactions is to see how a work of cinema becomes literature in its own right, something to be read, argued over, and reread in the minds of those who carry it. One critical voice reads the film as a class allegory. Here is a man born outside privilege, gazing longingly into its glittering halls and realizing that no amount of mimicry can earn true entry. His crime, in this view, is not only murder but aspiration, an attempt to leap the chasm between working-class obscurity and the sunlit ease of inherited wealth. Scholars in this camp write about the yachts, the villas, the linen suits as symbols of a class so insulated it doesn't even notice the longing eyes at its margins. They argue that the violence is inevitable, not because of personal pathology, but because of the cruelty of exclusion. The movie becomes, in their hands, less a thriller than a parable of capitalism's cruelty. What happens when the outsider is allowed to taste privilege, but never to swallow it whole? Another perspective frames the film through psychology, seeing in the protagonist a study of sociopathy. Critics here note the absence of guilt, the fluidity of identity, the capacity to mimic affection without truly feeling it. They argue that his brilliance lies not in intellect, but in emotional manipulation, in reading others with such precision that he can reflect them back like a mirror. For these interpreters, the story is not tragedy, but diagnosis. It fascinates not because we sympathize, but because we are terrified by the realization that such masks could walk among us. Yet even within this reading, dissent arises. Some argue that his longing, his brief flashes of vulnerability, complicate the diagnosis, that he is not a monster from birth, but a man shaped by rejection. A third school of thought focuses on sexuality and desire. Released at the end of the 1990s, the film dared to present desire in ways that unsettled heteronormative boundaries. His affection for the golden heir, at once admiration, envy, and longing, has been dissected endlessly. Some critics see it as romantic desire he cannot admit, others as asexual envy that masquerades as love. The ambiguity itself becomes the point. Desire, in this story, is never straightforward, never pure. It is tangled with identity, with imitation, with a wish not only to love someone, but to be them. Scholars have called this a rare depiction of fluidity in mainstream cinema, noting how its refusal to label his longing makes it both more authentic and more unsettling. Cinematic critics often highlight the film's use of setting as text. They point out how Italy functions not merely as backdrop, but as metaphor, the sunlit piazzas and azure waters representing the allure of privilege, while also concealing danger beneath their beauty. The contrast between golden landscapes and dark deeds has been praised as a deliberate inversion of the noir tradition. Instead of rain-slicked alleys and shadows, the crimes unfold under blinding sunlight. This, critics argue, forces us to see how corruption doesn't lurk only in darkness but thrives in beauty, how violence can exist in the most idyllic settings. Then there are perspectives rooted in literary theory. Highsmith's novel, on which the film is based, is itself a text obsessed with identity, mimicry, and the slipperiness of morality. Scholars note how the film preserves the ambiguity of the novel rather than smoothing it into Hollywood's usual clarity. The ending, particularly, has been the subject of essays. Some see it as punishment, others as liberation, others as the ultimate imprisonment. The silence at the close becomes a Rorschach blot, each viewer projecting their own fears into it. For literature-minded critics, this ambiguity is the essence of the story. It resists closure, forcing us to wrestle with questions rather than comforting us with answers. Audience reactions reveal another layer. Many confess to being disturbed by how much sympathy they felt for the protagonist. They hated what he did, but they understood why he did it. Letters to newspapers, early online forums, and later retrospectives all contain variations of the same confession. I didn't want to root for him, but I did. That unsettling sympathy became a topic of debate. Was the film irresponsible for seducing viewers into empathy for a killer, or was it profound for forcing us to confront the human impulses that blur morality? Audiences were split, but the fact of the split itself is telling. The film succeeded not in uniting opinion, but in fracturing it, leaving each person to confront their own complicity in the act of watching. The key movie events themselves have been mined for meaning. The boating scene, for instance, is read as both literal murder and symbolic erasure, the moment when rejection becomes intolerable and yearning collapses into violence. Critics note how the sun shines relentlessly during the act, refusing to cloak it in shadows. The jazz clubs, with their improvisational energy, are interpreted as metaphors for his identity. Fluid, improvisational, always shifting to match the room. The letters he forges are seen as textual performances, writing as deception, the written word weaponized. Even the wardrobe choices, The heir's immaculate whites against his slightly rumpled imitations are dissected as symbols of class masquerade. One of the most debated events is the final silence. Scholars argue fiercely about what it means. Some see it as the ultimate punishment. He has succeeded in deception, but at the cost of eternal loneliness, condemned to wear a mask forever. Others see it as triumph. He has become so skilled at imitation that he has, in effect, created himself anew. Still others interpret it as tragedy. He has erased himself so thoroughly that nothing remains but the performance. That multiplicity of readings is what elevates the film to the realm of literature. It is not about answers, but about questions. For me, the critical perspectives that resonate most are the ones that embrace contradiction. The protagonist is both victim and villain, both sympathetic and monstrous. The film is both beautiful and horrifying, both seductive and repulsive. The settings are both idyllic and sinister. The ending is both triumph and tragedy. It is this refusal to settle into one register that makes the story endure. Life is contradiction, and so is this film. When I think of the movie events, I find myself returning not to the violence, but to the small humiliations that preceded it. The mocking smiles, the careless dismissals, the moments when privilege reminded him of his place. Those were the real turning points, the microaggressions that festered until they erupted. It reminds me of how often in life, it is not the grand betrayals, but the small, repeated exclusions that break us. The film captures that truth with painful accuracy. And perhaps that is why critics still write about it, why audiences still remember it. Because beneath the glamour and the horror lies something ordinary, the desire to belong, the pain of rejection, the masks we wear to survive. The film simply pushes those ordinary truths to their extreme, forcing us to see what we might prefer to ignore. The making of this film is its own kind of story, one layered with accidents of fate, the stubbornness of vision, and a series of choices that could so easily have gone another way. To look behind the camera is to see how fragile its creation was, how easily it might have been dismissed as a glossy thriller, and how carefully it was shaped into the haunting meditation we now know. It began, of course, with a novel. Patricia Highsmith's book had already left its mark decades earlier, the French adaptation Plein Soleil having etched a certain image of the antihero into cinematic memory. To revisit the material in the late 1990s was, in itself, a gamble. Hollywood was not particularly eager to fund stories about ambiguity and moral slipperiness. It preferred clear heroes and villains. Yet the director chosen for this project believed in nuance, in complexity. He saw in a novel not a crime story, but a character study, and he insisted on preserving its unsettling ambiguity. That decision, more than any technical flourish, saved the film from becoming ordinary. Casting became its first crucible. The lead role passed through several hands before settling. Some actors were considered too polished, too confident, too visibly powerful to play a man defined by insecurity and mimicry. What was needed was someone who could look fragile one moment and calculating the next, someone who could believably disappear into another person's aura. When the role landed on a young actor who had recently risen to fame, the fit surprised many. Known more for charm and menace, he was not an obvious choice. It was precisely that quality, his openness, his boyishness, that made the descent into obsession so chilling. He himself admitted in interviews that playing the role unsettled him, because it forced him to mind his own fears of being an outsider in Hollywood. Life and art blurred in unsettling ways. The Golden Heir was another casting gamble. Several actors were tested, but it was the one with natural charisma, a voice that carried the careless lilt of privilege, who won the role. His performance, praised for both magnetism and cruelty, was shaped in part by his off-screen energy. He and the lead developed an uneasy rapport during filming, friendship layered with competitiveness, that mirrored their characters' dynamic. Off-set, he was quick to joke, to tease, sometimes even to overshadow, and the tension bled into their scenes together, sharpening the authenticity of admiration, curdling into resentment. The The woman caught between them was cast for her warmth and intelligence. Her ability to convey both trust and suspicion was essential. She spoke later of how difficult it was to place sincerity in a story so soaked in deception. Yet her performance became the moral compass of the film, grounding its spirals of lies in a human register. Her wardrobe, silks, dresses that seemed to shimmer in Italian light, became iconic, but she admitted to feeling constantly out of place on set, an odd reflection of her character's own gradual unease. Filming in Italy was both blessing and curse. The beauty of Positano, Ischia, and Rome provided the visual splendor that defined the film's atmosphere, but it also created logistical nightmares. Narrow streets made transporting equipment nearly impossible. Locals sometimes treated the production as a curiosity, gathering in crowds, interrupting takes. Weather shifted suddenly, forcing adjustments in lighting and continuity. Yet those very challenges gave the film its texture. Crew members remembered how the chaos of real Italian life often seeped into the background of shots. Vendors shouting, children playing, music drifting through windows. None of it was staged, but all of it enriched the world on screen. The yacht and boating sequences were the most technically demanding. Shooting on water is notoriously difficult. Waves shift cameras, sunlight blinds lenses, sound is swallowed by wind. Scenes of confrontation had to be repeated again and again until the actors were sunburned and exhausted. That exhaustion became part of the performances. When tempers flared and movements grew sloppy, it looked authentic because it was. Crew members later said that the Mediterranean itself felt like a character, both dazzling and cruel, conspiring with the story to make beauty inseparable from violence. Wardrobe, too, became a production obsession. Costumes were tailored to signal class difference with subtle precision. The heir's clothes were perfectly cut, effortlessly stylish, while the protagonist's imitations were always slightly off, sleeves a little long, fabrics cheaper, collars stiff rather than relaxed. Viewers might not consciously notice these differences, but they register subconsciously, reinforcing his status as imitator rather than original. Costume designers spoke of agonizing over every button and shoe because they understood that clothing in a story about identity and belonging was itself a language. Music became its own character. Jazz, with its improvisation and fluidity, was chosen deliberately. The heir, comfortable in that world, embodies its looseness. The protagonist, imitating, struggles to keep up. Several actors were trained to perform instruments or vocals, fumbling through rehearsals until they could fake ease. Those struggles paralleled their characters' attempts to appear natural in a world where they did not belong. The soundtrack became not just accompaniment, but metaphor. Identity itself as improvisation, as mimicry, as invention on the fly. Editing the film was a long and delicate process. Early cuts leaned too heavily into thriller conventions, emphasizing chase and suspicion. The director fought for slowness, for lingering shots of silence, for moments where nothing seemed to happen but everything was being felt. Studio executives worried audiences would grow restless. But the director insisted that the tension lay not in action, but in watching performance crack, in the silences between words, in the glances that revealed too much. The final cut reflects that battle. Patient, unsettling, unwilling to rush. One fun fact is how many of the most cutting lines were improvised or rewritten on set. The heir's mockery of the protagonist often came from the actor's own instincts in a moment, tailored to cut in ways that felt personal. Crew members remembered holding their breath during takes, not sure if the words would leave the other actor in tears. That unpredictability made the insults feel real, sharpened by genuine tension. The film's release carried its own surprises. Many expected it to be a stylish but niche thriller. Instead, it sparked conversation far beyond the box office. Critics praised its ambiguity, its performances, its refusal to resolve neatly. Debates erupted about morality, identity, sexuality. Audiences returned to it not for comfort, but for unease, drawn back to the questions it refused to answer. The strangeness of its success lay in how much it unsettled. Hollywood often rewards neatness, but here was a film that thrived on mess. For the cast, the production was transformative. The lead actor, once known mainly for charm, was suddenly recognized for depth, for daring. The Air's performer cemented his reputation as both heartthrob and actor of range. The actress found her career reshaped by the attention her nuanced role received. Even supporting players, with smaller parts, spoke of how the experience lingered. For many, shooting in Italy under the weight of such complex material was unforgettable, a collision of glamour and grit they never quite shook off. Looking back now, what strikes me most about the production is how much it mirrored the story. Just as the protagonist slipped into masks and performances, the film itself slipped between genres: thriller, romance, tragedy, never belonging wholly to one, but convincing enough to pass as each. Just as he sought to belong to a world that rejected him, the filmmakers sought to create a work that belonged in Hollywood while resisting its formulas. And just as he was both triumphant and doomed, the film was both celebrated and unsettling, embraced yet never entirely comfortable. Behind the scenes, then, is not a tale of scandal or disaster, but of persistence and subtle rebellion. The strange facts are not explosive, but they are revealing. The improvisations that became immortal lines, the wardrobe choices that told silent stories, the exhaustion that made violence feel real, the music that mirrored identity, the editing that fought for silence over spectacle. Together, they shaped a film that feels inevitable now, though at the time, it was anything but. The settings in this story are more than landscapes. They're psychological terrains, mirrors reflecting both allure and dread. Every piazza, every villa, every yacht is chosen with a precision that turns architecture into character, light into metaphor, and silence into a form of dialogue. To watch the film without attending to its settings is to miss half of its power, because the world it builds is not simply a stage, but the very essence of its meaning. Italy, first of all, is not accidental. The Mediterranean light is dazzling, merciless in its brightness. Where traditional thrillers cloak violence in shadows, this one exposes it under an unforgiving sun. The violence on the boat, the lies spun in cafes, the shifting identities performed at dinner tables, all take place beneath a sky so clear it feels accusatory. This inversion unsettles us. Beauty becomes complicit in horror. I remember feeling that unease most strongly in the sequences set along the Amalfi Coast. The water sparkles like glass, the villas gleam like promises, and yet, beneath all that glitter, dread hums. It made me realize how deeply the film weaponizes beauty, how it asks us to consider that the most dangerous acts can unfold in the most idyllic places. Rome, with its grandeur, functions differently. Its cathedrals, piazzas, and echoing streets are filled with history, with a weight of permanence. Against this backdrop, the protagonist's shifting identities feel fragile, temporary, paper-thin. The camera often frames him small within vast architecture, reminding us of how precarious his masquerade is. These shots whisper that no matter how convincing his performance, the world he longs to enter has roots deeper than mimicry can reach. Rome becomes a judgmental parent, watching silently, unimpressed by his games. The villas and apartments serve as intimate stages for class and identity. The Heir's villa is airy, sun-drenched, decorated with a kind of careless elegance that signals wealth without effort. It feels open, inviting, but also exclusive, a sanctuary that the protagonist never fully inhabits. His own rented rooms, by contrast, are cramped, shadowed, filled with second-hand furnishings. The camera lingers on these contrasts, the marble of one space against the peeling plaster of another. They're not just homes, but emblems of belonging, or the lack of it. Watching these shifts, I thought of how our own spaces reflect what we believe we deserve, how environments reinforce identity. Yachts, of course, carry their own symbolic weight. They are floating kingdoms of privilege, spaces where leisure is performed and observed. The boat sequences are claustrophobic despite the openness of the sea. On deck, there's laughter, jazz, flirtation. Below deck, there is confrontation, violence, silence. The yacht becomes a paradoxical setting, both stage for performance and coffin for truth. Its gleaming surfaces conceal the blood that stains them, and once again, beauty becomes both lure and accomplice. Cinematography elevates all of these settings into text. The camera loves light, but it does not flatter indiscriminately. It caresses marble, linen, skin, but it also sharpens edges, letting shadows creep into corners. The protagonist is often framed in mirrors, reflections layered upon reflections, a visual reminder of his fractured identity. Windows and doorways are used repeatedly, creating frames within frames that suggest imprisonment. He is always caught between spaces, inside and outside, included and excluded, self and mask. The effect is claustrophobic even in the most expansive settings, as though no amount of space can free him from his own performance. Sound deepens the atmosphere. The lapping of waves, the clinking of glasses, the chatter of cafes. These sounds immerse us in Italy, but they also serve as reminders of the life he longs to inhabit. Jazz, improvisational and fluid, threads through the story as both literal soundtrack and metaphor for identity. The air plays jazz with ease, embodying the freedom of someone at home in improvisation. The protagonist imitates, struggles, fakes, always a half-beat behind. The music becomes a cruel reminder that belonging cannot be fully forged, that imitation can approximate but never equal authenticity. Editing shapes our perception of these spaces. Party sequences are cut with looseness, capturing laughter and movement in a way that feels improvisational. By contrast, moments of deception are edited with precision, cutting sharply between performances and reactions, heightening tension. Silence is preserved in therapy-like moments of suspicion, when another character's gaze lingers too long, when a mask threatens to slip. The rhythm of cuts mirrors the rhythm of paranoia, fluid at first, jagged later, until the entire film pulses with unease. Wardrobe design intertwines with setting to reinforce class distinctions. In sunlit villas, the air wears loose, immaculate whites and linens, clothes that suggest comfort with both wealth and climate. The protagonist's suits are slightly too stiff, slightly too dark, slightly too eager. In Rome, surrounded by grandeur, his attempts at refinement falter under scrutiny. Even in the most elegant settings, his clothes betray him. Costume becomes another kind of architecture, another setting he inhabits without ever mastering. Symbolism saturates these cinematic elements. The sea is not just geography but fate, beautiful, infinite, merciless. Boats are not just transport, but prisons, stages for intimacy and violence. Villas are not just homes, but emblems of exclusivity. Mirrors are not just props, but metaphors for identity. Jazz is not just music, but narrative structure. Italy itself becomes a character, seductive, cruel, complicit. For me, the most haunting element of the settings is their ordinariness. None of these are fantasy landscapes. They are real places, sunlit and bustling, filled with tourists and locals. And yet, within them, identity collapses, masks are donned, lies are stolen. It makes me wonder how many masks, how many deceptions, unfold unnoticed in the piazzas we stroll, the cafes we sip coffee in, the parties we attend. The film unsettles not because its world is foreign, but because it feels too familiar, too possible. That, perhaps, is the genius of its cinematic elements. They make the extraordinary seem ordinary, and the ordinary seem extraordinary. They remind us that beauty and horror can share the same frame, that light can conceal as much as it reveals, that belonging can feel just one villa, one jacket, one lie away. And in doing so, they transform setting from background into text, from decoration into revelation. Behind the scenes of this film lies a story just as layered, and at times just as unsettling as the one it brought to the screen. To explore it is to realize how fragile its existence was, how close it came to being something else entirely, and how the alchemy of actors, locations, and sheer persistence transformed it into a work of haunting resonance. The journey began with Patricia Highsmith's novel, a book already steeped in reputation. The question was not whether the story was worth adapting, but how to adapt it for a late 90s audience accustomed to moral clarity. Hollywood, at that time, leaned toward films that rewarded virtue and punished vice. Yet here was a text built on ambiguity, on a protagonist who murders, deceives, and yet compels our empathy. The director chosen for the project understood this tension. He was determined not to flatten the story into a conventional thriller, but to lean into its moral slipperiness, to create a film that invited unease rather than resolution. This decision shaped everything that followed. Casting became the first crucible. The role of the protagonist passed through a number of hands. Executives floated established stars who could guarantee box office numbers, but the director resisted. He wanted someone younger, someone with enough vulnerability to make the descent into darkness both plausible and tragic. When a role went to a rising actor known for his boyish charm, it seemed an odd fit. Yet once filming began, the choice proved inspired. The actor approached the role not as a villain, but as a fractured soul and his off-screen insecurities, about belonging, about Hollywood's hierarchies, bled into the performance. Watching the dailies, crew members remarked how uncanny the overlap felt. A young man on screen longing to belong, and a young man off-screen trying to hold his place in an unforgiving industry. The casting of the Golden Heir and his partner carried its own peculiarities. The heir was played by an actor whose charisma seemed almost effortless, his presence filling a room in ways that blurred into the character's privilege. Off-screen, he often took on the role of instigator, leading outings, joking with the crew, exuding the same aura of casual command his character embodied. The woman caught between them was cast for her intelligence and warmth. She admitted later that filming was emotionally draining because her role required her to trust characters built on lies. Yet her empathy grounded the story, anchoring it in human stakes. The chemistry between these three actors, at times affectionate, at times competitive, created the electricity that made the relationships on screen so jagged and alive. Location shoots in Italy became another source of behind-the-scenes stories. The production moved between Rome, Ischia, Positano, and Venice, each presenting its own challenges. Crew members struggled to haul equipment through narrow cobbled streets, to block off piazzas that refused to quiet down, to film on waters that shifted constantly beneath their feet. Locals watched with amusement, sometimes wandering into shots, sometimes offering unsolicited advice. One anecdote tells of an entire day lost because a fisherman refused to move his boat from the background, insisting that if Hollywood wanted authenticity, his boat was as authentic as it got. That obstinacy, infuriating at the time, gave the film a texture of reality. It is difficult to fake a world that refuses to bend to your staging. The yacht scenes were particularly grueling. Shooting on water required endless resets, cameras swayed, lighting shifted, actors grew sunburned and seasick. Tempers flared, yet those very conditions seeped into the performances. The exhaustion, the frayed nerves, the claustrophobia, they all became part of the confrontation's authenticity. When violence finally erupted on screen, it carried the rawness of real fatigue. Crew members later said they knew they had captured something extraordinary, not because it looked perfect, but because it felt unsettlingly real. Wardrobe and props offered another layer of backstage fascination. The costume designer obsessed over subtle distinctions. The heir's clothing effortlessly stylish, the protagonist slightly off, as though copied from magazines, but never quite right. Jackets too stiff, sleeves slightly too long, ties a shade too dark. These details were invisible to most viewers, but they worked subliminally, reinforcing the sense of a man imitating privilege rather than embodying it. The props team faced similar tasks: letters, passports, typewriters, all forged to withstand close scrutiny. The letters especially became mini-performances. The forged handwriting had to be perfect, because in this story, text itself is deception. Music rehearsals became their own curious spectacle. Because jazz was integral, actors trained in instruments and vocals to create authenticity. They practiced for hours, fumbling and improvising, until they could convincingly fake ease. Ironically, their struggle mirrored the protagonists, outsiders trying to pass in a world that wasn't naturally theirs. Cast and crew joked that the rehearsal rooms were their own kind of method acting, with each wrong note reinforcing the themes of imitation. Improvisation extended beyond music. Several of the most cutting lines of dialogue were born in the moment, the air's mocking humor sharpened by the actor's instinct. These lines landed so cruelly that sometimes the camera caught real hurt flashing across the protagonist's face. The director chose to keep those takes, recognizing that authenticity often lives in discomfort. The tension between actors, affectionate yet competitive, infused their scenes with a friction that could not have been scripted. Editing the film became a long and delicate process. Early cuts leaned too heavily on suspense, tipping the balance toward thriller. The director pushed back, demanding space for silences, for shots that lingered past comfort. Executives worried about pacing, but the final cut leaned into restraint. The editor later described the process as holding a breath as long as possible and only cutting when you absolutely had to exhale. That patience is what gives the film its haunting rhythm. Release brought its own surprises. Some in Hollywood dismissed it as too European, too languid, too morally ambiguous for mainstream audiences. Yet when it premiered, it became a conversation piece, praised for its beauty and its unease. Critics wrote about its lush cinematography, its unsettling performances, its refusal to resolve neatly. Awards followed, cementing its place not just as an adaptation, but as a defining work of its decade. For the cast, the production left deep marks. The lead actor often spoke about how difficult it was to shed the character, how living so long in duplicity and paranoia had seeped into his psyche. The Air's actor described the role as freeing, a chance to revel in charisma and cruelty. The actress remembered the Italian shoots as both dreamlike and exhausting, a blur of beauty and dread. Even decades later, they speak of the film with reverence, as though it was less a job and more crucible. The strangest insight of all is how much the behind-the-scenes mirrored the story itself. Just as the protagonist slipped between roles, the actors slipped between performance and reality, their off-screen rapport shaping their on-screen tensions. Just as the character imitated privilege, the crew imitated ease, struggling through chaotic shoots to create the illusion of glamour. Just as the story blurred beauty and horror, the production lived in the friction between sunlit landscapes and grueling logistics. In both life and fiction, masks were worn, roles were played, truths were concealed. That is what lingers for me. The sense that the making of the film was itself a kind of Ripley performance, an imitation of ease hiding strain, an act of creation that mirrored the very themes it portrayed. And maybe that is why the final product feels so seamless, because it was born from struggle, from improvisation, from the refusal to compromise on ambiguity. Behind the camera, as on screen, the truth was slippery, but the result was undeniable. Themes in this story move like undercurrents, always there, sometimes invisible, sometimes crashing into the surface with a force that cannot be ignored. The film is remembered for its performances, its lush Italian settings, its unsettling plot twists, but what truly makes it endure are the ideas it wrestles with, ideas that feel less like academic abstractions and more like intimate confessions. To analyze them is to hold up a mirror and risk seeing not just Tom Ripley, but ourselves. The most obvious theme, and perhaps the most painful, is identity as performance. Ripley does not possess a solid self in the way most characters do. He is not anchored by family, community, or class. He is defined by mimicry. His talent is watching and then becoming. He can play piano convincingly without being a musician. He can impersonate a voice with eerie accuracy. He can forge signatures until they are indistinguishable. He doesn't just wear masks. He is a mask. The tragedy is that he does not know what face lies beneath. This theme resonates because it whispers truths about how all of us perform, shifting tones in different rooms, dressing differently depending on the company. Ripley simply takes this to its extreme, and in doing so, forces us to ask, when does adaptation stop being survival and start becoming erasure? Closely tied to this is the theme of class and belonging. Ripley is not simply envious of Dickie Greenleaf's wealth. He is envious of what wealth allows: ease, freedom, acceptance without question. Dickie can be careless, cruel, even lazy, and the world still bends toward him. Ripley, in contrast, must labor endlessly to be noticed, to be tolerated, to be allowed inside. The yachts, the villas, the silk shirts are not just luxuries. They are symbols of doors closed to those who are not born to them. This class tension thrums through every scene, reminding us how privilege is not only about money, but about unspoken entitlement, about moving through the world as if it were yours by birthright. Desire is another central theme, and it is complicated. Ripley's longing for Dickie is not simply envy, nor is it simply attraction. It is both and neither. He does not just want Dickie's affection. He wants to be Dickie, to step inside his skin, to inherit his ease, his charm, his belonging. This fluid, ambiguous desire unsettled audiences in 1999, but it is precisely what gives the story its richness. Love, envy, obsession, they collapse into one another until they are indistinguishable. The theme of desire here is not romantic, but existential. The yearning to dissolve the boundary between self and other, to erase the distance between longing and possession. Violence emerges as both act and metaphor. The murder on the boat is shocking, yes, but also feels inevitable. The physical eruption of years of humiliation, of small dismissals and mocking smiles. Violence here is not senseless, but rooted in the unbearable tension between yearning and rejection. Later acts of violence follow the same pattern. Not cold-blooded calculation, but desperate attempts to preserve a mask, to keep the illusion alive. Violence becomes the cost of performance, the price of maintaining a lie. The theme is chilling because it suggests that beneath every mask we wear, there lies a breaking point, a moment when the strain of imitation collapses into rage. Deception is, of course, everywhere. Forged letters, false voices, identities constructed and discarded. But deception here is not only external, it is internal. Ripley deceives others, but more tragically, he deceives himself. He convinces himself that if he can just play the role well enough, the role will become reality. The tragedy is that performance can never become truth. No matter how convincing, it always requires vigilance, always risks collapse. The theme of deception thus becomes existential. What happens when a man convinces himself that the mask is the face? Symbolism deepens these themes at every turn. Mirrors appear throughout the film, capturing Ripley in fragments, reflections layered upon reflections. They remind us that he is never whole, always doubled, always fractured. The sea is another recurring symbol, beautiful, infinite, merciless. It is the stage for violence, the witness to secrets, the abyss that swallows bodies and truths alike. Yachts symbolize privilege and confinement simultaneously, floating palaces that are also prisons of intimacy, where envy festers and masks crack. Clothing functions as symbol too, Dickie's immaculate whites and linens representing ease, Ripley's ill-fitting suits signaling imitation, always slightly wrong. Jazz carries its own symbolic weight. Improvisational, fluid, unpredictable, it mirrors identity itself. Dickie inhabits jazz effortlessly, his voice blending into its rhythms, his body relaxed in its spontaneity. Ripley imitates, struggles, fakes, always half a beat behind. Jazz becomes the cruelest reminder that authenticity cannot be forged, it must be lived. Even letters, simple sheets of paper, are laden with symbolism. They become performances of identity, written deceptions that convince others of presences that no longer exist. In a story about masks, the written word itself becomes a mask, concealing absence with ink. The theme of isolation emerges most powerfully in the final silence. Ripley succeeds in everything he set out to do. He gains wealth, recognition, a life of apparent belonging. Yet he is utterly alone, condemned to maintain a lie that can never relax. The silence is suffocating because it reveals the deepest truth. To live entirely as performance is to erase oneself. Success, in this story, is indistinguishable from damnation. For me, the most haunting theme is not deception or violence, but the fragility of belonging. Ripley reminds us that to belong is the most human of desires, and also the most dangerous when unmet. His tragedy is that he mistakes admiration for love, performance for acceptance, mimicry for intimacy. And while most of us will never take his path, we understand the impulse. We, too, wear masks to fit, to be included, to be welcomed into circles that are not ours. The film unsettles because it magnifies this impulse until it becomes monstrous, forcing us to confront the prison of our own performances. And so the themes and symbols weave together into a tapestry of unease. Identity as performance, class as exclusion, desire as obsession, violence as eruption, deception as survival, isolation as consequence, mirrors, seas, yachts, clothes, jazz, all whispering the same truth. That longing can consume us, that masks can imprison us, that the cost of becoming someone else may be the erasure of ourselves. That, I think, is why the film lingers long after it ends. Not because of its beauty, not because of its violence, but because it asks a question we would rather not face. If you could wear a mask so convincing it gave you everything you wanted, love, wealth, belonging, would you ever dare take it off? Filmmaking is often most powerful when it refuses to call attention to itself, when its techniques whisper rather than shout. This film is built on that whisper. Its choices are subtle, deliberate, precise, designed not to dazzle, but to disturb, not to overwhelm, but to seduce. When we study how it was made, we begin to see how every frame, every note of music, every cut of editing is part of a larger design meant to draw us into complicity with Tom Ripley's lies. And when we extend our gaze to the box office, we see how a story so morally ambiguous, so resistant to neatness, managed to seduce the marketplace as well, creating its own unexpected kind of triumph. Cinematography is where the film's restraint is most visible. The camera adores light, but it does not flatter indiscriminately. It lingers on Mediterranean blues, sunlit piazzas, golden villas, but it also sharpens the contrast when dread creeps in. Violence is not hidden in shadows, but exposed in unforgiving brightness. This is an inversion of noir. Where darkness usually cloaks sin, here light does. The camera also leans heavily on reflections. Ripley is caught in mirrors, in glass windows, in surfaces that fracture and duplicate. The visual grammar tells us, even without words, that he is never whole, never singular. One detail I've always remembered is how he is often framed at the edge of grandeur, just a little too small for the architecture around him, dwarfed by statues or doorways. The world he wants is always bigger than he is, reminding us of his outsider status even as he tries to inhabit it. Lighting carries similar symbolic weight. Dickie and his circle are bathed in natural sunlight, warmth that feels effortless. Ripley, by contrast, often moves through interiors lit with lamps, dim, claustrophobic. When he enters Dickie's villa, light pours over him as though he's stepping into a different world. When he returns to his own rooms, shadow reclaims him. The lighting design creates a visual tug-of-war between belonging and exclusion, desire and dread. What I love is how unshowy it all is. The choices are invisible if you aren't looking, but felt in your bones nonetheless. Sound design is equally subtle but devastating. Italian marketplaces hum with chatter. Jazz clubs burst with improvisation. Boats creak against the sea. These ambient details immerse us in setting, but they also underscore mood. Jazz itself is more than music. It is metaphor. Dickey plays it with ease, embodying its looseness, its freedom. Ripley imitates, struggles, copies, always a step behind. The improvisational nature of jazz mirrors identity itself. Spontaneous for some, desperate performance for others. Silence, too, is wielded as sound. In the final scenes, silence becomes unbearable, pressing against us like a weight. It is the silence of isolation, of masks becoming prisons. Editing defines the film's rhythm. Party scenes are cut with looseness, letting laughter and music spill. Intimate conversations, by contrast, are edited with patience, holding too long on faces, letting silences stretch past comfort. Violence is cut abruptly, almost jarringly, stripping it of grace and leaving it raw. The editing creates a rhythm of seduction and rupture. We are lulled by beauty, then jolted by dread. It mirrors Ripley's own trajectory. Charm followed by violence, beauty followed by horror. Performance, of course, is framed as centerpiece. The camera is patient with faces, trusting that the smallest flicker of doubt or envy will carry more weight than grand gestures. The director encouraged improvisation, allowing tension between actors to spill onto screen. The insults Dickey hurls feel unscripted because many of them were. The longing in Ripley's gaze feels unsettling because it was drawn from the actor's own insecurities. The camera doesn't interfere. It simply captures, trusting that human expression is more compelling than any trick of technique. Symbolism in the techniques is pervasive. Yachts are filmed as both luxurious and claustrophobic, sunlight bouncing off waves while danger simmers below deck. Costumes are framed to emphasize their differences. Dickey's loose elegance versus Ripley's stiff mimicry. Letters are filmed in close-up, the handwriting almost fetishized because text itself is identity in this world. Mirrors catch Ripley in halves. Doors frame him as though he's always on the threshold, never quite inside. Every technical choice is a metaphor disguised as a detail. Then there is the matter of box office. This film was no guaranteed success. It was expensive to shoot on location in Italy. It starred actors not yet fully cemented as box office draws, and it told a story of moral ambiguity with no clear hero. Studio executives worried it would be too dark, too European, too morally unsettling. And yet, upon release, it performed strongly, especially overseas. Audiences were captivated by its beauty, its glamour, even as they were unsettled by its dread. Critics praised it, awards bodies recognized it, and slowly it carved out a place not as blockbuster, but as a cultural conversation piece. The success is strange because it mirrors Ripley's own deception. Just as he passed himself off as something he wasn't, the film passed itself off as a glamorous thriller while secretly being a psychological tragedy. Marketing leaned on its beauty. Sunlit Italy, elegant clothes, jazz-filled parties. But once audiences were inside, they were confronted with horror and ambiguity. The brilliance is that the trick worked. Viewers came for beauty and stayed for unease. The film, like Ripley himself, seduced before it revealed its true self. Internationally, the response was even stronger. In Europe, especially Italy and France, critics praised its fidelity to Highsmith's moral ambiguity. Scholars began writing about it in journals, dissecting its themes of class, desire, and identity. In the United States, audiences were more divided. Some enthralled, others disturbed by its refusal to punish or redeem its protagonist neatly. But even the division proved its power. The film was not forgettable. It was argued over, debated, remembered. For me, the box office story is part of the film's poetry. Just as Ripley must constantly perform to survive, so did the film. It dressed itself in glamour and beauty to lure audiences, then revealed something darker beneath. Its success was not the triumph of spectacle, but of seduction. And that, perhaps, is its greatest irony. A film about masks had to wear one of its own to thrive. Looking back now, the filmmaking techniques and box office success are inseparable. The techniques gave us a film that whispers rather than shouts, that unsettles rather than comforts. The box office gave us proof that audiences, even in an era of formula, were hungry for something ambiguous, something morally slippery, something that reflected their own hidden longings. Both remind us that cinema, like identity, is a performance, and when the performance is convincing enough, it becomes truth. The cast of this story is more than a group of performers. They're the very instruments through which the film breathes. To speak about them is to speak about how art and life blur, how actors bring not only craft but fragments of themselves, and how audiences, in turn, respond with both admiration and unease. What makes this film endure is not only its narrative and setting, but the flesh-and-blood humanity the cast poured into it, sometimes knowingly, sometimes by accident. At the center stands Matt Damon as Tom Ripley. At the time, Damon was riding the wave of success from Good Will Hunting, carrying with him the aura of a brilliant young talent who had written his own destiny. What's fascinating is how this off-screen narrative of belonging and recognition clashed with the on-screen character defined by longing and exclusion. Damon himself admitted in interviews that Ripley unsettled him. He spoke of struggling with the character's loneliness, of finding it exhausting to live in someone so desperate to be loved, yet incapable of revealing himself. He also confessed that the physical transformation, learning piano, studying mannerisms, adjusting posture, was part of his way into Ripley's mimicry. Audiences were shocked to see him embody such duplicity after the sincerity of his earlier roles. Critics noted that his Ripley was not just chilling, but heartbreakingly fragile. He played him as a boy always on the verge of tears, which made the violence feel less like cold calculation and more like desperate collapse. Opposite him was Jude Law as Dickie Greenleaf, the golden heir whose charisma intoxicates and wounds in equal measure. Law, still early in his career, brought an energy that was both dazzling and dangerous. In interviews, he described Dickie as a man who loved being loved, someone who thrived on attention but gave it carelessly. Law spoke of enjoying the freedom of playing someone so magnetic, so oblivious, so casually cruel. Off-screen, his natural charm often drew people to him, and that dynamic bled into the film. Damon's Ripley looked at Law's Dickie with the same mix of awe and envy that many felt toward Law himself. Critics praised his performance as one of the great embodiments of privilege on screen, effortless, radiant, infuriating. Many argued that without Law's charisma, Ripley's obsession would have made less sense. Then there was Gwyneth Paltrow as Marge Sherwood, the woman who loved Dickie and became Ripley's quiet adversary. Paltrow approached Marge with a softness that belied steel. In interviews, she described the difficulty of playing someone who trusts too easily, who wants to believe the best, even when her instincts warn otherwise. She admitted that Marge's arc, moving from warmth to suspicion, was painful to inhabit because it required her to show how women are often gaslit by charm and appearances. Critics saw Marge as the film's conscience, the one figure who insists on seeing truth even when others are content with lies. Paltrow's own elegance and intelligence grounded the film in emotional reality, balancing the masculine energy of Damon and Law with grace. Cate Blanchett's Meredith Logue offered another fascinating layer. Though her screen time was limited, Blanchett's presence was unforgettable. She played Meredith as a woman of privilege, but not malice, someone who mistook Ripley's lies for intimacy. Blanchett later said that she approached the role as though Meredith lived in a kind of dream, floating through Italy without realizing how dangerous the games around her were. Audiences remembered her scenes vividly, noting how her elegance and naivete made her the perfect pawn in Ripley's deception. Critics pointed out that Blanchett's performance hinted at themes of mistaken identity and the blindness of privilege. She believed Ripley because she wanted to, not because his lies were flawless. Philip Seymour Hoffman, as Freddie Miles gave the film its jolt of menace. Where others were seduced by Ripley, Freddie saw through him. Hoffman played Freddie with swagger and disdain, a man too secure in his privilege to be charmed by imitation. In interviews, Hoffman admitted he relished the role, enjoying the chance to needle Damon on set and off. His Freddie was sharp, mocking, dismissive, everything Ripley feared most: exposure. Critics adored Hoffman's performance, calling it a masterclass in how a supporting role can tilt the balance of film. His scenes with Damon bristled with tension, because Hoffman radiated suspicion that Ripley could not deflect. The ensemble as a whole worked with eerie harmony. Law's charisma, Paltrow's warmth, Blanchett's elegance, Hoffman's menace, all revolve around Damon's fragile intensity. Their off-screen relationships mirrored their on-screen dynamics. Law and Damon reportedly developed a genuine fondness tinged with rivalry, echoing Ripley and Dickey's dangerous friendship. Paltrow's elegance off-camera matched Marge's quiet grace, while Blanchett, still building her international reputation, floated through the production with the same curiosity Meredith carried. Hoffman, irreverent and blunt, pushed Damon in ways that sharpened their confrontations. Audiences responded with fascination and discomfort. Many confessed to being unsettled by how much sympathy they felt for Ripley. Damon's performance made him pitiable even at his worst, and Law's magnetic cruelty made audiences understand why Ripley longed for him. Viewers left theaters debating not just the film's morality, but their own. Did they root for Ripley? Did they want him to succeed in his lies? Why did they feel a pang of sorrow for him at the end, despite everything? These questions spilled into reviews, essays, late-night conversations.